The only sound was the groan of rusted iron. A key, thick and heavy as a crucifix, turned in the lock of the old tobacco shed. The heavy cypress door, warped by decades of Mississippi humidity, scraped against the packed earth floor as it was heaved shut, sealing the world outside. Inside, the darkness was absolute, a physical presence that swallowed light and hope whole. It smelled of dust, of decay, and of the faint, sweet ghost of cured tobacco leaves from harvests long past. A man named Moses was on the floor, his breathing harsh in the suffocating silence. He had been thrown in, not led. His crime? An imagined slight, a look held a second too long, an act of defiance so subtle only a monster would have perceived it. Outside, in the fading light of the late afternoon, two men stood. One, the overseer, Thomas Thistlewood, Jr., slid the key into his pocket, his face as placid and unreadable as a stone. The other, a neighboring planter named Beauchamp, licked his lips, his eyes glinting with a gambler's avarice. The terms of their arrangement, their macabre wager, had been settled just moments before. 50 silver dollars, a significant sum in 1807, against a prime field hand, a man valued at nearly 10 times that amount. The bet was horrifyingly simple, a testament to the casual cruelty of their world. Thistlewood wagered that he could starve a man to death in precisely 40 days. Not a day more, not a day less. Beauchamp, ever the opportunist, had taken the bet, arguing that no man, especially one as strong as Moses, could perish so predictably. He believed the man's will would break, that he would be driven mad by thirst long before starvation could claim him, forcing Thistlewood's hand. They shook on it. A gentleman's agreement. And as the last sliver of daylight vanished, the 40-day countdown began, turning the small, forgotten shed into a laboratory for a forbidden and horrifying experiment in human suffering. The year is 1807. The place, the Natchez district of the Mississippi Territory, a land of brutal contradictions. Here, fortunes of unimaginable size were being carved out of the fertile black soil, built on the back of a single, voracious crop, cotton. The cotton gin had transformed this region into the epicenter of a new global economy, a kingdom of white gold. But this kingdom was built on a foundation of human misery, its fields fertilized with sweat and blood. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the oppressive humidity that rolled in from the river, mingling with the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms and the ever-present stench of fear. Plantations, vast and isolated empires, dotted the landscape, each ruled by men who wielded absolute power. We are on one such plantation, known by the deceptively gentle name of Whispering Pines, a sprawling tract of land owned by an absentee landlord named Silas Croft. Croft resided in the cool comfort of a Philadelphia mansion, his hands clean, his conscience clear, concerned only with the numbers that appeared on his quarterly reports. This distance, this deliberate ignorance created a vacuum of accountability. Into that vacuum stepped men like Thomas Thistlewood, Jr. On these remote frontiers of human bondage, the overseer was not merely a manager, he was a king, a despot. His word was law, his whim was justice, and his cruelty was unchecked by any higher authority. The nearest magistrate was a day's ride away, and was, in any case, a fellow planter who shared his views on property management. The isolation of Whispering Pines was both geographic and moral. It was a world unto itself, a place where the normal rules of humanity had been suspended, and something ancient and predatory had been allowed to fester in the shadows, far from prying eyes. Thomas Thistlewood, Jr., was not a man given to outbursts of rage. He did not need to be. His terror was of a colder, more deliberate variety. He was a student of cruelty, a practitioner of a dark and methodical science of human subjugation. Standing a little above average height, with a wiry frame that concealed a surprising strength, his most unsettling feature was his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and they seemed to look right through a person, assessing them not as a human being but as a piece of machinery, weighing their utility, their breaking point, their capacity for suffering. He had come to Mississippi from the sugar plantations of Jamaica, where his father, a man of legendary brutality, had perfected the family trade. The elder Thistlewood had left behind a series of infamous journals, clinical and horrifyingly detailed accounts of torture, punishment, and psychological warfare. His son had inherited not just the name, but the philosophy. He believed that productivity was directly proportional to fear. A happy slave was a lazy slave. A compliant slave was one who lived in a state of perpetual low-grade terror, who knew that at any moment, for any reason, their world could be unmade. He managed Whispering Pines with a chilling efficiency. The crop yields were the highest in the district, a fact that kept his employer, Silas Croft, perfectly satisfied. Croft never asked about Thistlewood's methods, and Thistlewood never offered any explanation. There was a bland knowledge in the air, a silent understanding. The other planters in the region regarded him with a mixture of awe and revulsion. They admired his results but were disturbed by the coldness with which he achieved them. He was a necessary evil, a tool for taming the wilderness and the people within it. But some whispered that Thistlewood was more than just a brutal overseer. They said he was a man without a soul, a man who found a quiet, disturbing pleasure in his work. Moses was not just a name on a ledger, not just a prime field hand as the wager had so clinically defined him. He was a man in his late 20s, broad-shouldered and powerful, with hands calloused from a lifetime of labor under a merciless sun. He had a wife, Sarah, a cook in the main house, and a 5-year-old daughter named Lily, who would watch for him from the cabin door every evening, her face lighting up when he finally appeared, weary but unbroken, from the endless rows of cotton. Moses was respected among the enslaved community at Whispering Pines. He was quiet but not sullen. He worked hard but he did not bow. There was a core of defiance in him, a quiet dignity that Thistlewood, with his predatory instincts, had sensed from the moment he arrived. The overseer saw this flicker of an unbroken spirit as a threat, a contagion that could spread. It was an affront to his entire philosophy of control. The incident that led to his horrifying punishment was almost nothing. While mending a piece of equipment, Moses had met Thistlewood's gaze and held it for a moment too long. There was no insolence in the look, merely the reflexive action of one man acknowledging another. But in Thistlewood's twisted perception, it was a challenge to his authority, a silent declaration of equality that could not be tolerated. He needed to make an example of Moses. But a simple whipping would not suffice. A whipping healed. It was a temporary pain. Thistlewood wanted something more profound, something permanent. He wanted to demonstrate the totality of his power, to show everyone at Whispering Pines that he was the master of not just their labor, but their bodies, their time, and their very existence. He wanted to unmake a man slowly, piece by piece, in front of them all. The bet with Beauchamp was merely a convenient pretense, a way to add a veneer of sport to an act of pure, calculated sadism. The first day of the wager dawned with a sickening sense of normalcy. The plantation bell rang at the same pre-dawn hour, its hollow clang rolling across the fields. The enslaved workers emerged from their cabins, their faces grim, their movements stiff with a new and potent fear. They lined up for their meager rations of cornmeal and salted pork, their eyes carefully fixed on the ground, avoiding each other's gazes, avoiding the sight of Thistlewood, who stood on the porch of his house, sipping coffee as he watched them. And they especially avoided looking toward the old tobacco shed that sat near the edge of the woods, a new and malignant feature in their familiar landscape. Inside that shed, Moses was contending with the first pangs of a calculated deprivation. The darkness was disorienting, a thick, smothering blanket that erased the passage of time. Was it morning? Midday? He couldn't tell. The air was still and hot, and the silence was broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the frantic beating of his heart. At first there was disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Someone would come. Sarah would raise the alarm. But as the hours stretched into an eternity, a cold dread began to seep into his bones. He knew Thistlewood. He knew the man's capacity for cruelty. The overseer, for his part, went about his duties with an unnerving calm. He rode out to the fields, inspecting the new cotton bolls, his voice even and low as he issued orders. To any outsider, it was just another day at Whispering Pines. But it was a performance. Every measured step, every calm command was designed to amplify the terror. It was a message to the other slaves, I can erase one of you, and the world will not stop turning. Life will go on, and you will keep working. The psychological weight of that silent shed fell upon the entire plantation, a macabre and disturbing pall of dread that would only deepen with each passing day. By the third day, a grim routine had established itself. The plantation moved to a new, unspoken rhythm, dictated by the silent, suffering presence in the tobacco shed. The other enslaved people worked with a frantic, desperate energy, hoping that perfect compliance might somehow protect them from a similar fate. Laughter, once a rare but precious commodity in the slave quarters, vanished entirely. It was replaced by whispers, furtive and fearful, exchanged in the brief moments when the overseer's gaze was elsewhere. They spoke of Moses, wondering, dreading. Was he still alive? Was he calling out? But the shed remained stubbornly silent. Its thick walls, designed to keep the humidity in for curing tobacco, now served to lock the sounds of suffering away from the world. Thistlewood seemed to revel in the oppressive atmosphere he had created. He made a point of walking past the shed several times a day. He would pause, stand there for a moment with his hands on his hips, head tilted as if listening for something. Then, a faint, cruel smile would touch his lips, and he would continue on his way. This small, theatrical gesture was a fresh turn of the screw, a reminder to everyone of the experiment he was conducting. For Moses, these first few days were a battle against his own body's rebellion. The initial hunger was a sharp, gnawing pain in his belly. Thirst was a dry, rasping fire in his throat. He licked the condensation from the damp earth floor, a futile attempt to find moisture. He paced the small space, his powerful muscles already beginning to feel weak and unsteady. He tried to shout to batter the door, but his cries were swallowed by the insulated walls, and the solid wood didn't even tremble beneath his fists. The darkness was a constant torment, playing tricks on his mind. He began to see phantoms in the shadows, to hear a low, macabre hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his prison. As the first week drew to a close, the psychological toll on the enslaved community deepened into a state of collective trauma. The tobacco shed was no longer just a building. It had become a forbidden monument to Thistlewood's power. Children were shushed if they played too close to it. Adults would trace long, looping paths through the yard to avoid passing it. It radiated a coldness, a sense of profound wrongness that was palpable. Sarah, Moses's wife, was a ghost of her former self. Forced to continue her duties in the main house kitchen, she moved like an automaton, her eyes hollow, her face a mask of unspeakable grief. Thistlewood took a particular sadistic pleasure in tormenting her. He would comment on the food she prepared, remarking how a starving man would give anything for even a crust of bread. He would ask her if she'd heard any strange noises from the woods, feigning concern. Each word was a poisoned dart, designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain. The other women in the community tried to comfort her, but what comfort could be offered? Their gestures of solidarity had to be hidden, conducted in secret, lest they be seen as a form of rebellion. An elderly woman named Mama Elodie, a keeper of old traditions and stories from Africa, began to speak of a curse. She claimed that an act of such profound evil, of soul leading, as she called it, would stain the land itself. She warned that Thistlewood was not merely killing a man. He was inviting a dark spirit to take root at Whispering Pines, a spirit of hunger and despair that would never leave. Her words, whispered in the dead of night, spread like wildfire through the quarters, transforming their fear into a kind of superstitious dread. The overseer was no longer just a cruel man. He was a conjurer of something ancient and horrifying. Inside the shed, Moses's world had shrunk to the basic, brutal realities of his own failing body. By day 10, the sharp pains of hunger had subsided into a dull, constant ache. His body, in its desperate wisdom, had begun to consume itself. The powerful muscles of his arms and back, once his pride and the source of his value to the plantation, were melting away, leaving his skin hanging loosely from his bones. His thoughts grew sluggish, drifting in a fog of weakness and dehydration. Time became a meaningless concept. The only markers were the subtle shifts in temperature as the sun beat down on the roof during the day and the relative cool of the night seeped through the walls. He lost track of how long he had been there. Was it days? Weeks? He spent long periods in a state of semi-consciousness, his mind conjuring vivid hallucinations. He saw fields of corn, rivers of cool, clear water. He saw Sarah's face, her smile, and the image was so real it brought a fresh wave of agony. But sometimes the hallucinations were more macabre. He imagined Thistlewood's pale blue eyes staring at him from the impenetrable darkness, watching him, studying him like an insect pinned to a board. In these moments, he understood the true nature of the overseer's experiment. This wasn't just about killing him. It was about observing the process. It was a cold, scientific inquiry into the deconstruction of a human being. The shed was Thistlewood's laboratory, and he was the specimen. This realization was more terrifying than the hunger, more painful than the thirst. It was the horror of being reduced from a man to a thing, an object of a disturbing and forbidden curiosity. His struggle was no longer just for survival, but for the last shreds of his own humanity against a force that sought to erase it completely. The story of the wager at Whispering Pines is a piece of forbidden history, the kind that is rarely written down, actively suppressed, and left to fester in the shadows of the official record. It's a macabre cold case, not of a murder that was hidden but one that was performed in plain sight. These are the stories we are committed to unearthing. If you believe these dark histories need to be dragged into the light, no matter how disturbing, consider subscribing to the channel. Because the meticulous, almost scientific, way in which Thomas Thistlewood managed his horrifying experiment is even more unsettling than the bed itself. He began to keep a private journal, much like his infamous father in Jamaica. In a small, leather-bound book, he chronicled what he called the 40-day endeavor. His entries were not emotional or boastful. They were chillingly detached, written in a neat, precise script. He noted the weather each day. He speculated on the subject's physiological state. Day 12, one entry reads, subject should be entering the advanced stages of protein energy malnutrition. Muscular atrophy will be significant. Cognitive function likely impaired. He was treating a human life as a set of variables, a biological process to be observed and documented. He even recorded the reactions of the other slaves, referring to them as the control group. He wrote of their increased productivity and subdued demeanor, noting with satisfaction that the demonstration is proving effective. This journal reveals the true depth of his depravity. He was not a man driven by passion or rage. He was cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of empathy. He saw himself as a scientist pushing the boundaries of his field being the total domination of other human beings. The journal was his lab notebook, the plantation his laboratory, and Moses, his unwilling subject in a monstrous and unholy study of death. Around the middle of the third week, something shifted in the atmosphere of the plantation. The initial shock and terror began to curdle into a silent, simmering rage. It was a helpless fury, for there was nothing they could do. Any open act of defiance would be met with swift and brutal retribution. Yet the human spirit, even when cornered, will seek ways to resist. The resistance at Whispering Pines was subtle, almost invisible. Tools would break with unusual frequency. A row of cotton would be picked just a little too slowly. These were small, desperate acts of sabotage, a way of screaming into a void. One night, a young boy named Samuel, no older than 15, decided he could bear it no longer. He had looked up to Moses, who had taught him how to set snares and read the signs of the weather. Driven by a mixture of grief and youthful bravery, Samuel crept out of his cabin after midnight, clutching a small gourd of water and a piece of stolen cornbread. His plan was simple and desperate: to dig under the back wall of the tobacco shed, a place obscured from the main house by a thicket of overgrown bushes. He worked for nearly an hour, his bare hands scraping at the hard, clay-packed earth. The soil was unforgiving, and the silence of the night amplified every sound. He was just about to give up when his fingers broke through to the other side. A wave of foul, stagnant air washed over him. He whispered Moses' name into the small hole, his voice trembling. There was no response at first, just a faint, raspy breathing from within. He pushed the gourd and the bread through the opening, whispering again, "Moses, it's Samuel, take this, please." For a moment nothing happened. Then a weak skeletal hand emerged from the darkness and feebly closed around the gourd. Samuel's heart leaped with a desperate hope, but his hope was short-lived. A twig snapped behind him. He spun around, his blood running cold. There, standing like an apparition in the moonlight, was Thistlewood. Thistlewood did not shout. He did not need to. The silence that stretched between him and the terrified boy was more frightening than any sound could be. Samuel was frozen, the dirt still under his fingernails, his heart hammering against his ribs. The overseer's pale eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. He simply stared at Samuel for a long, agonizing moment, then his gaze shifted to the small hole at the base of the shed wall. A slow, thin smile spread across his face, a look of profound and disturbing satisfaction. He had known someone would eventually try. He had been waiting for it. It was another variable in his experiment, a test of the collective will of his subjects. Without a word, he grabbed Samuel by the collar, his grip like iron, and dragged him back toward the slave quarters. The next morning, the entire plantation was orked to assemble in the main yard. Thistlewood brought Samuel out, his face bruised and swollen. He then produced the gourd of water and the half-eaten piece of cornbread, placing them on a stool for all to see. He spoke in a low, even voice, his words dropping like stones into the horrified silence. He explained that Samuel had attempted to interfere with plantation discipline. He called it an act of theft, not of bread, but of authority. He announced that for this crime, the 40-day clock on Moses would be reset. The bet was void. A new one would begin tomorrow, and Moses would receive no food or water for the remainder of the original term as punishment for conspiring with the boy. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. He had not only caught the would-be savior, but he had twisted the act of compassion into a new form of torture for the man who was already dying. He was punishing Moses for being the object of pity. As for Samuel, he was subjected to a brutal whipping, each lash a public declaration that hope, in any form, was forbidden at Whispering Pines. The resetting of the clock was an act of psychological warfare of the highest order. It was a masterstroke of cruelty that shattered the last vestiges of hope among the enslaved community. Before, they had been counting the days, clinging to the morbid endpoint as a form of release, a conclusion to the horror. Now, even that was taken from them. The timeline was extended, the suffering prolonged indefinitely. The message was clear. There was no escape, not even in the finality of the wager. Thistlewood was in complete control of the narrative of life and death. Inside the shed, Moses was only dimly aware of these events. The small amount of water Samuel had given him had briefly cleared the fog in his mind, but it was a cruel mercy. It only served to make him more aware of his own agony, sharpening the edges of his suffering. When the expected rations, however meager, did not appear with the dawn, a new, deeper despair set in. He had no way of knowing why, no way of understanding the twisted game being played outside his prison. All he knew was that the faint glimmer of hope he had felt was an illusion. The darkness in the shed seemed to press in on him, thicker and more malevolent than before. He could feel his own life force ebbing away, a slow, draining tide he was powerless to stop. The outside world had ceased to exist. His reality was now confined to four walls, a dirt floor, and the relentless, gnawing emptiness inside him. He was becoming a ghost while still alive, his existence fading, his humanity being systematically erased by a force he could not fight, a malice he could not comprehend. The whispers of a curse, once confined to the slave quarters, now felt like a tangible reality. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable, horrifying conclusion to Thistlewood's macabre game. On the 25th day of the new wager, a visitor arrived at Whispering Pines. It was the planter, Beauchamp, the other party to the bet. He rode up to the main house, a jovial, portly man whose easy smile did little to conceal the predatory nature that lay beneath. He had come to check on his investment. He and Thistlewood sat on the veranda, drinking bourbon as the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. The tobacco shed was clearly visible from where they sat. Beauchamp gestured toward it with his glass. "How fares our subject?" he asked, a hint of morbid curiosity in his voice. "Progressing as expected," Thistlewood replied, his tone flat and clinical. "The interruption by the boy set us back, but the secondary effects of the extended deprivation have accelerated the desired outcome." Beauchamp chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "You have a stomach for this, Thistlewood, I'll give you that. Most men would have tired of the affair by now." Thistlewood took a slow sip of his bourbon, his pale eyes fixed on the shed. "It is not a matter of stomach," he said quietly. "It is a matter of principle, an inquiry into the limits of control." Their conversation was disturbingly casual. The words they used, subject, outcome, inquiry, were borrowed from the world of science and agriculture, deliberately stripping the situation of its human horror. They spoke of Moses as if he were a strain of cotton being tested for its resilience to drought. This detached, almost academic approach was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire affair. It revealed a worldview in which black bodies were not human, but objects, resources, and, in this case, a playing piece in a gruesome game. As they spoke, Sarah was serving them, her hands trembling as she refilled their glasses. She was forced to listen to them discuss her husband's slow, agonizing death as if it were a matter of bookkeeping. Beauchamp, emboldened by the bourbon and his own callous nature, made a proposal. "I wish to see him," he said, his eyes gleaming. "A first-hand observation. It's only fair, given my stake in the matter." Thistlewood considered this for a moment. His experiment had until now been conducted with a degree of privacy. He was the sole observer, the master of his laboratory. But the request appealed to his sense of showmanship, his pride in his own monstrous work. He agreed. He retrieved the heavy iron key from his study, and the two men walked across the yard toward the shed, their boots crunching on the dry grass. A few enslaved people, working late near the barns, saw them and froze, their hearts seizing with a fresh wave of dread. This was a new and horrifying escalation. Thistlewood unlocked the door, and for the first time in over a month, light pierced the suffocating darkness within. He pulled the door open just wide enough for them to peer inside. The stench that billowed out was overwhelming, a putrid smell of sickness and human waste. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust. What they saw was a scene from a nightmare. Moses was huddled in the far corner, a skeletal figure barely recognizable as a human being. His skin was stretched taut over his bones, his eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, and they burned with a feverish, vacant light. He did not seem to notice the door opening. He was rocking back and forth, muttering to himself, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. Beauchamp, for all his bravado, took an involuntary step back, his face paling. He had wagered on a man's life, but he had not truly comprehended the visceral reality of what that meant. This was not an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing horror. Thistlewood, however, was unmoved. He looked at Moses with the dispassionate gaze of a physician examining a terminal patient. He noted the visible signs of severe emaciation, the shallow breathing, the apparent delirium. He saw not a man in his death throes, but the successful culmination of his hypothesis. "As you can see," he said to Beauchamp, his voice low and steady, "the subject is well into the final phase. Total systemic failure is imminent. I predict another 10 days, perhaps 12. He spoke as if providing a weather forecast. He then closed the door, the sound of it thudding shut echoing with a dreadful finality, and locked it once more, plunging Moses back into the darkness. The two men walked back to the veranda in silence. Beauchamp seemed shaken, the jovial mood of earlier completely evaporated. He finished his drink quickly, made his excuses, and rode off into the twilight, leaving Thistlewood alone with his thoughts. The visit had served its purpose. It had not only validated Thistlewood's methods, but had also spread the legend of his unparalleled cruelty. The story of what Beauchamp had seen would be told, in hushed tones, at taverns and social gatherings throughout the district, cementing Thistlewood's reputation as a man not to be trifled with, a master of his domain. For Thistlewood, it was a quiet triumph. He recorded the visit in his journal that night, noting Beauchamp's visible signs of squeamishness, which he interpreted as a weakness of character. His final entry for the day was simple and horrifying. The experiment proceeds on schedule. The outcome is no longer in doubt. The detached, scientific tone was a mask for a deep, disturbing vanity. He was proud of his work. He had successfully engineered the deconstruction of a human soul, and he considered it his masterpiece. The final 10 days were a slow, agonizing descent into the inevitable. The plantation operated under a shroud of grim anticipation. Work was done, meals were cooked, the sun rose and set, but all of it felt like a hollow pantomime performed on a stage set for tragedy. The air was thick with it. Mama Elodie claimed the land itself was sick, that the crops in the fields closest to the shed were beginning to wither, their leaves turning a sickly yellow despite the ample rain. She said the birds no longer sang in the trees near the shed, and that at night a strange, cold mist would gather around its foundations, a mist that felt like sorrow. Whether this was truth or a manifestation of the collective grief, it felt real to the people of Whispering Pines. They were living inside a ghost story as it was being written. Sarah had stopped speaking entirely. She performed her duties with a terrifying, empty precision, but her spirit had fled. She was a shell, hollowed out by a grief so profound it had no voice. The other slaves watched her with a mixture of pity and fear, as if her sorrow were a contagion they might catch. Thistlewood, in these final days, became even more meticulous in his observations. He would spend hours just sitting on his porch, his chair angled toward the shed, his gaze unwavering. He was like a vulture waiting for the last breath. He made notes in his journal about the lack of any sound from within. Subject has likely passed the point of vocalization, he wrote. Energy is being conserved for only the most essential autonomic functions. The silence is a data point in itself. He was extracting information from the absence of life, finding meaning in the encroaching void. His scientific detachment was reaching its zenith, a perfect, horrifying expression of his soullessness. He was not waiting for a man to die. He was waiting for his experiment to conclude. On the 39th day, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the air grew heavy and electric. The wind howled through the trees, making the pines around the main house whisper and moan. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the plantation grounds into a sea of mud. It felt like nature itself was weeping, or perhaps raging against the abomination taking place in the tobacco shed. The storm lasted through the night, a violent and fitting soundtrack for the final hours of Moses's life. Inside the shed, the world had dissolved into a blur of pain and fleeting consciousness. The last coherent thought Moses had was of his daughter, Lily, of her small hand in his. He clung to that memory as the last anchor of his identity, the final flickering ember of the man he had been. The storm outside was a distant, meaningless rumble. His universe was the cold dirt floor, the suffocating darkness, and the relentless crushing weight of his own body failing him. He was no longer hungry or thirsty. He was beyond that. There was only a profound, bottomless weariness. Death, which had been a terrifying specter for so long, now seemed like a gentle, welcome release, a quiet door opening at the end of a long, dark corridor of pain. His last breath was likely a small, imperceptible sigh, a final letting go. It was a breath unheard by anyone, a life extinguished in utter solitude, witnessed only by the indifferent darkness of his prison. Outside, the storm raged on, washing the world clean, but it could not wash away the stain of what had been done in that small, lightless building. The evil was now part of the soil, part of the story of the place, a permanent and unforgivable scar on the land. The 40th day dawned quiet and unnaturally bright. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The world looked fresh and new, a cruel irony given the grim business of the day. This was the day the wager was to be settled. Thistlewood rose, dressed with his usual meticulous care, and ate his breakfast. He made his morning rounds, his demeanor as calm and unruffled as ever. He was performing his role to the very end. Around mid-morning, Beauchamp arrived, his horse kicking up mud from the rain-soaked ground. He looked less jovial than on his last visit, his face etched with a certain grim reluctance. He was here to see the thing through, to settle his debt, but the sport had long since gone out of it. The two men exchanged curt nods. No pleasantries were needed. They walked together toward the tobacco shed, their path now a well-trodden track. A small crowd of enslaved people had gathered at a distance, their faces a mixture of dread and a desperate need to bear witness. They stood silently, their presence a mute testament to the life that had been so cruelly taken. Sarah was not among them. She remained in the kitchen, a prisoner of her own grief. Thistlewood reached the shed door. He pulled the heavy iron key from his pocket, the same key he had used 40 days ago. The sound of it sliding into the lock was unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. It turned with a harsh, grating screech, a sound of finality. He paused for a dramatic moment, his hand on the door, then he pulled it open, allowing the bright morning sun to flood the dark interior for the first time in over a month, revealing the horrifying conclusion to his experiment. The sight within the shed was a macabre tableau of human cruelty. Moses lay on the dirt floor, his body contorted, little more than a skeleton draped in skin. The bright sunlight seemed to mock the profound darkness that had filled this space for so long. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, at a world he could no longer see. The sheer physicality of his decay was shocking. It was the endpoint of a long and terrible equation, the logical conclusion of a monstrous premise. Beauchamp made a choked sound and turned away, unable to look. But Thistlewood stepped inside. He knelt beside the body, not with reverence or remorse, but with the clinical curiosity of a naturalist examining a specimen. He placed 2 fingers on the side of Moses's neck, searching for a pulse he knew he would not find. He noted the rigor mortis, the coolness of the skin. He was confirming his results, ensuring the experiment had been a success according to his own twisted criteria. 40 days, as predicted, Thistlewood said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He stood up and turned to Beauchamp, who was still looking away, his face a sickly green. "You owe me $50. The words hung in the air, grotesque and obscene. The reduction of a man's entire life, his suffering, his family's grief, to a mere financial transaction. It was the ultimate act of dehumanization. Beauchamp, fumbling inside his coat, pulled out a small leather pouch and tossed it to Thistlewood. The clink of the silver coins was a sickening sound in the sacred silence that should have surrounded a place of death. Thistlewood caught the pouch, weighed it in his hand for a moment, and then pocketed it without a word. The bet was settled. The business was concluded. The aftermath was as chilling as the act itself. With the wager settled, Thistlewood's interest in Moses's body instantly evaporated. The specimen had yielded its data, it was no longer of any use. He turned to 2 of the enslaved men who were watching from a distance, their faces etched in horror. "Get him out of here," he ordered, his voice flat. "Bury him, and then tear this shed down. I have no more use for it." The order to destroy the shed was perhaps his only acknowledgement of the structure's new, horrific significance. He wanted the monument to his cruelty erased, not out of shame, but out of a simple, practical desire to remove a now useless tool. The 2 men, relatives of Moses, entered the shed, their movements slow and heavy with grief. They gently wrapped his emaciated body in a spare burlap sack, their hands trembling as they performed this final, sorrowful duty. They carried him away, not to the small, designated slave cemetery, but deep into the woods, to a place they chose themselves, a place where they could give him a semblance of a dignified farewell, away from the prying eyes of their tormentor. As they worked, others began the grim task of dismantling the tobacco shed, board by board. It felt like a desecration, but also a necessary exorcism. They wanted it gone, wanted to erase the physical evidence of the horror that had transpired within its walls. But they all knew that tearing down the building would not tear down the memory. The story was now etched into their souls, a forbidden tale to be passed down in hushed whispers for generations. The curse Mama Elodie had spoken of had come to pass. Whispering Pines was now a haunted place, not by the ghost of Moses, but by the living memory of the evil that had been done to him. News of the wager and its horrifying conclusion spread through the Natchez district, but not in the way one might expect. There was no public outcry, no investigation, no justice. Thistlewood had broken no laws that mattered to the society in which he lived. An overseer had disciplined a slave. The slave had died. In the cold calculus of 1807 Mississippi, this was a private matter, a question of property management. The story was told among the planters, not as a tale of horror, but as a legend of a different sort. It became the ultimate story of overseer authority, a testament to Thistlewood's iron will. While some were privately disgusted by the theatrical cruelty of the bet, many were secretly impressed by his ability to maintain absolute control. His reputation, already formidable, grew to mythic proportions. He became the man you hired when a plantation was considered unmanageable, when the property was rebellious. He was a human tool of terror, and his value in the marketplace of human suffering increased. Silas Croft, the plantation's owner in Philadelphia, received a report that simply stated a slave named Moses had died of a fever, and that an old, unused shed had been torn down due to rot. The $50 Thistlewood won was a private, unrecorded profit. The system was designed to insulate men like Croft from the gruesome realities of their wealth, to sanitize the brutality and reduce it to clean, neat numbers on a ledger. The true story vanished from the official record, becoming a piece of forbidden history, a ghost in the machine of the Cotton Kingdom. It existed only in the oral traditions of the enslaved, a cautionary tale, a memorial, and a curse. For the people of Whispering Pines, life after the wager was a changed landscape of fear. The spot where the tobacco shed once stood remained bare. The grass refused to grow there, or so the story went. It became a patch of blighted earth, a physical scar mirroring the one on their collective soul. The children were forbidden from ever setting foot on it. Mama Elodie would perform small rituals there at night, leaving offerings of herbs and water, not for the spirit of Moses, whom she said was at peace, but to appease the wounded land itself. Thistlewood remained the overseer for another year, ruling over a plantation that was now perfectly, terrifyingly compliant. The productivity of Whispering Pines reached an all-time high. There were no more infractions, no more subtle acts of defiance. He had successfully killed not just a man, but the very spirit of resistance. His experiment was a resounding success, but the people were not broken, they were waiting. They watched him with a deep, silent hatred, a patience born of profound suffering. They knew his evil was a fire that would eventually consume itself. Sarah, Moses's wife, eventually ran away. One night she and her daughter Lily simply vanished. Thistlewood organized a half-hearted search, but it was clear he didn't care. They were flawed property now, tainted by the events. Most assumed they were caught and sold or perished in the swamps. But the story whispered in the quarters was different. It was said that the spirit of Moses himself had guided them north, that the ghost of his love was stronger than the overseer's hate, and that they had made it to a place of freedom. It was a story they chose to believe, a small act of rebellion, a way of giving Moses the last word, a victory of the spirit over the flesh. The fate of Thomas Thistlewood, Jr., is as murky and disturbing as his life. He did not die a peaceful old man. His brand of systematized cruelty, while effective, made him many enemies, not just among the enslaved, but among whites as well. His cold, arrogant demeanor and the quiet contempt he held for everyone, regardless of color, left him isolated. He eventually left Whispering Pines, taking on a position at an even larger, more remote sugar plantation deep in the Louisiana bayou, a place notorious for its brutal conditions, a place where men like Thistlewood could operate with even greater impunity. The details of his end are lost to history, pieced together from fragmented letters and local legends. The most persistent story is that he was not killed in an uprising or by a vengeful slave. Instead, the tale holds that he simply vanished. One day, he rode out to inspect the farthest reaches of the plantation and never returned. His horse was found wandering a week later, but of Thistlewood there was no sign. The official assumption was that he was thrown from his horse and succumbed to the swamp, a victim of snakes or alligators. But the enslaved people on that plantation told a different, more macabre story. They said the swamp itself had claimed him. They whispered that the spirits of all the people he had tormented, led by a tall, powerful shade who had once been starved in a shed, had risen from the muck and dragged him down into a watery, unmarked grave. They claimed that on still nights, you could hear his voice calling out from the bayou, not in anger, but in a thin, reedy whisper, begging for a crust of bread, a drop of water. It was a fittingly gothic end for a man whose life was a study in horror, a final, poetic justice delivered not by the hand of man, but by the cursed land he had so brutally exploited. The journal of Thomas Thistlewood, Jr., his 40-day endeavor, was not destroyed. It was found among his meager possessions after he vanished. The plantation owner, seeing no value in it, sold it along with other effects to a traveling merchant. For decades, the small, leather-bound book passed through various hands, its horrifying contents likely unread or misunderstood. It eventually found its way to a small, private archive of Southern history, where it sat on a dusty shelf, miscatalogued and forgotten. It was only rediscovered in the mid-20th century by a doctoral student researching the economics of antebellum plantations. The student, expecting dry accounts of crop yields and expenses, was horrified by what he found. The journal was a banned text, a first-hand account of a crime so monstrous it defied belief. He tried to publish his findings, but he was met with resistance. The historical societies of the time were more interested in romanticizing the Old South than in exhuming its most disturbing truths. The story of Moses and the wager was deemed too macabre, too inflammatory. It was a cold case that certain powerful people wanted to remain buried forever. The journal was suppressed, locked away in a restricted access section of the archive, accessible only with special permission that was rarely granted. The story was deemed too dangerous, a forbidden history that challenged the carefully constructed myths of the past. But like all powerful stories, it refused to die completely. Rumors of its existence circulated among a small circle of historians, a whisper of a primary source document that laid bare the deepest evils of the slave system in a way no other text ever had. What does it mean to document an atrocity? The rediscovery of Thistlewood's journal poses a deeply unsettling question. In his own mind, Thistlewood was the author, the scientist, the one in control of the narrative. His clinical, detached language was a tool to distance himself from the horror he was inflicting, to transform an act of profound evil into a simple endeavor. He wrote himself as the protagonist of his own dark story. But in a strange, macabre twist of fate, his meticulous record-keeping is the very thing that prevents Moses from being completely erased. Rom history. Without the journal, the story of the wager would be nothing more than a faint whisper of folklore, easily dismissed as an exaggeration or a myth. The journal, for all its monstrous intent, becomes the primary evidence of the crime. It is Thistlewood's own hand that condemns him across the centuries. It provides the horrifying details that give the story its power. The $50 amount, the 40-day timeline, the resetting of the clock, the detached observations of a man's slow, agonizing death. It is an unimpeachable testament to the truth. And in its pages, Moses, the man Thistlewood tried to reduce to a subject, is resurrected. We learn his name. We learn of his perceived defiance. We see, through the cold lens of his killer, the quiet dignity that so enraged the overseer. The journal, intended as the ultimate monument to Thistlewood's power, becomes an accidental memorial to his victim. It ensures that we remember not just the monster, but the man he tried and failed to completely destroy. This is the enduring power of these forbidden histories. They preserve the names of the forgotten and bear witness to their stolen lives. We are now approaching the final act of this story, a point where the veil is fully lifted on the systemic evils that made such an event possible. To ensure you don't miss the conclusion of this and other cold cases from history's darkest corners, take a moment to subscribe and join our community. The darkness we explore here is not just about individual monsters like Thistlewood. It's about the systems that create them. The story of the wager is horrifying not just because of one man's sadism, but because of the society that permitted it. The legal framework of the time defined enslaved people as chattel property, giving owners and their proxies, like Thistlewood, near absolute power of life and death. A man could not be charged with murdering his own property any more than he could be for killing his own livestock. This legal dehumanization was the bedrock upon which Thistlewood built his house of horrors. Furthermore, the economic pressures of the Cotton Kingdom incentivized brutality. Plantation owners like Silas Croft were rewarded for looking the other way, as long as the profits continued to flow. The overseer who could extract the most labor for the least cost was considered the most successful. Fear was a cheap and effective tool. In this context, Thistlewood was not an anomaly. He was the ultimate expression of the system's logic. He was what the Cotton Kingdom required, a man willing to do whatever it took to maximize profit, a man for whom the humanity of his workforce was a mere obstacle to be overcome. The bet with Beauchamp was not an act outside this system. It was a grotesque parody of it, a game of speculation where the commodity being wagered upon was a human soul. The location of the Whispering Pines plantation is now lost to time. The great houses of the Natchez district have mostly been reclaimed by the land, their columns crumbling, their fields overgrown with kudzu and pine. But the story of what happened there persists, a piece of local folklore, a ghost story told to frighten children. The patch of land where the tobacco shed stood is said to be cursed, a place where nothing will grow and where the air is always cold. Some say that if you visit the area on a hot, still summer night, you can still hear the faint, scraping sound of a young boy trying to dig under a wall, and the dry, rasping whisper of a man begging for water. These stories are the legacy of Thistlewood's cruelty. They are the echoes of a trauma so profound that it has seeped into the very landscape, staining the soil with its memory. The official histories of the region will speak of cotton yields, of wealthy planters, of economic growth. They will not speak of Moses. They will not speak of the wager. This is the great crime of historical memory. It remembers the powerful and forgets the powerless. It builds monuments to the architects of systems of oppression and buries the stories of their victims in unmarked graves. But the whispers remain. The folklore, the ghost stories, the forbidden tales passed down through generations, these are the true monuments. They are the stubborn, resilient memory of the people who suffered, a refusal to let the crime be forgotten, a quiet insistence that a man named Moses lived, and that his life mattered. The curse is not a supernatural one. It is the curse of remembering an evil that can never be undone. Let us reflect on the nature of the bet itself. It was more than a simple wager, it was a piece of theater. The two men, Thistlewood and Beauchamp, were performing for an audience. Their audience was the other planters to whom they would recount the story, and more importantly, the enslaved population of Whispering Pines. For the planters, it was a display of ultimate mastery, a story that reinforced their own power and the utter disposability of the people they owned. It was a dark form of entertainment, a sport that affirmed their godlike status. But for the enslaved, it was a carefully constructed play of terror. Every element was designed for maximum psychological impact. The public nature of the confinement, Thistlewood's daily, silent vigils by the shed, the brutal punishment of Samuel for his act of compassion, and the final, public revelation of the body. This was not just about killing one man. It was about terrorizing hundreds. It was a lesson, a 40-day sermon on the futility of resistance and the totality of the master's power. Thistlewood understood that true control was not just physical, it was psychological. He needed to conquer not just the bodies of the enslaved, but their minds, their hopes, their very will to be free. He sought to create a state of learned helplessness, a condition in which his subjects were so thoroughly terrorized that they would police themselves. The wager was the ultimate expression of this philosophy, a macabre and horrifying spectacle designed to break the collective spirit of a people by demonstrating, in the slowest and most agonizing way possible, that he, the overseer, was the sole arbiter of life and death. The story of Moses forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth about the banality of evil. Thomas Thistlewood, Jr., was not a raving lunatic or a demonic figure from a Gothic novel. By all accounts, he was intelligent, methodical, and disciplined. His journal reveals a mind that was rational, calculating, and frighteningly sane. He was a man who simply operated from a different set of moral premises, a worldview in which certain people were not people at all, but objects. His evil was not born of passionate hatred, but of a cold, indifferent dehumanization. This is, perhaps, the most disturbing part of the story. It is easy to dismiss a monster who is clearly insane. It is far more difficult to reckon with a monster who is, by all outward appearances, a rational man simply carrying his society's darkest principles to their logical conclusion. He was a product of his environment, an environment that commodified human beings and rewarded brutality with profit. He was a functionary of a system, an administrator of suffering. His journal, with its meticulous notes and detached language, is a testament to this. It reads like the logbook of an industrial process, where the raw material is human life, and the finished product is terror and compliance. The horror of Thistlewood is not that he was an aberration, but that he was, in a twisted way, an ideal representative of the system he served. He was the perfect overseer, the ultimate manager, a man who had successfully purged himself of the inefficient and unprofitable emotion of empathy. He was a man made of numbers and calculations, a ghost in his own machine. Consider for a moment the profound and desperate courage of Samuel. In a world designed to crush the human spirit, a 15-year-old boy chose to act. He knew the risks. He had lived his entire life under Thistlewood's reign of terror. He knew the price of defiance. And yet, he could not stand by and do nothing. His attempt to smuggle water and bread to Moses was not just an act of compassion. It was an act of radical rebellion. It was a declaration that, despite the overwhelming power of the overseer, human connection still mattered. It was a refusal to accept the dehumanization that Thistlewood was trying to enforce. In that small, secret act of digging in the dirt, Samuel was fighting against the entire brutal logic of his world. He was asserting that Moses was not a subject in an experiment, but a man, a neighbor, a friend who deserved help. Of course, his rebellion failed in the practical sense. He was caught, punished, and his actions were twisted to inflict even more suffering on Moses. From Thistlewood's perspective, Samuel's failure was proof of his own omnipotence. But from a historical and moral perspective, Samuel's act is a pinprick of light in an ocean of darkness. It is a reminder that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the impulse toward empathy and solidarity can survive. It is a testament to a courage that is rarely recorded in history books, the quiet, desperate bravery of the oppressed who, even when faced with impossible odds, choose to risk everything for the sake of another. His punishment was a tragedy, but his choice was a triumph of the human spirit. The absence of Silas Croft, the plantation owner, is a crucial element of this story. He is a ghost in this narrative, a man who profits from the horror but remains physically and morally distant from it. His hands are clean. He lives in Philadelphia, a city that was, at the time, a center of the abolitionist movement. It is entirely possible that Croft himself publicly decried the evils of slavery while privately reaping its rewards. This hypocrisy was not uncommon. Many of the wealthiest men in Th. North built their fortunes on the cotton and sugar produced by enslaved labor in the South. They were the silent partners in the enterprise of human suffering. Croft's distance allowed him to maintain a veneer of civility and deniability. He hired a man like Thistlewood precisely so he would not have to know the details. He created a system of moral insulation. Thistlewood was his tool, his lightning rod. Any evil that occurred at Whispering Pines was the overseer's responsibility, not his. But this is a self-serving lie. Croft was the architect of the system. He created the conditions that made a man like Thistlewood not only possible but necessary. His demand for maximum profit, his refusal to provide oversight, his deliberate ignorance, these were the choices that loaded the gun. Thistlewood merely pulled the trigger. The story of the wager is therefore not just the story of one sadistic overseer, but of an entire chain of command, an entire economic system that distributed guilt so thinly that no one man felt the full weight of it. Croft's sin was not one of action, but of a monstrous, profitable inaction. He was the quiet, respectable evil that enabled the loud, brutal one. Today, the concept of such a wager seems like something from a work of fiction, a macabre invention of a twisted imagination. But the horrifying truth is that the history of slavery is filled with well-documented acts of cruelty that are just as depraved, if not more so. The casual violence, the psychological torture, and the complete disregard for human life depicted in this story were not exceptions. They were features of the system. What makes the 1807 wager at Whispering Pines so uniquely chilling is its cold, calculated nature. This was not a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of rage. It was a premeditated, 40-day-long murder, framed as a game, and documented like a scientific experiment. It represents a chilling intersection of brutality, commerce, and a dark, pseudo-scientific curiosity. It lays bare the absolute depths of dehumanization that were possible within that world. It forces us to look directly into the abyss, to see what happens when one group of people is given absolute power over another, when empathy is extinguished, and human beings are reduced to entries in a ledger or variables in an equation. This story has been suppressed and forgotten for a reason. It is a deeply uncomfortable truth. It challenges our desire to find redeeming qualities in the past, to believe that such evil is rare. But its power lies in its unflinching portrayal of the darkness humans are capable of. It is a forbidden history that serves as a vital and terrifying warning. It reminds us that the line between civilization and barbarism is terrifyingly thin, and that systems of oppression, once established, can create monsters out of ordinary men. Ultimately, what became of the 50 silver dollars? It is a trivial detail in a story of such profound tragedy, yet it is a deeply symbolic one. Did Thistlewood spend it on fine bourbon, on a new saddle, on some fleeting, meaningless pleasure? The money itself was stained. It was currency earned from the slow, measured destruction of a human life. Each coin was a token of Moses's suffering, a small metal testament to a day he spent in darkness, starving, and alone. The $50 represents the ultimate commodification of a human soul. It is the price that Thistlewood and Beauchamp placed on a man's agony. In the grand economy of the Cotton Kingdom, a system that traded in billions of dollars and millions of lives, this small transaction is a perfect, horrifying microcosm. It reveals the core principle of the entire enterprise, that a human life has a price, that it can be bought, sold, wagered, and spent. Thistlewood pocketed the coins and moved on. For him, it was just another day's earnings, but the ghost of that transaction lingers. It is a symbol of the moral bankruptcy that lay at the heart of his world. The money is long gone, spent and circulated, its dark origins washed away by the tides of commerce. But the debt it represents can never be repaid. It is a spiritual and historical debt, a stain that remains long after the silver has tarnished and the hands that exchanged it have turned to dust. The $50 is the final, chilling period at the end of a long and horrifying sentence. The story of the overseer's bet did not die with its participants. It became a part of the hidden scripture of the oppressed, a sorrow song passed down in secret. It was told by parents to children not to frighten them, but to educate them about the brutal reality of the world they inhabited. It was a story about the nature of power, the depths of human cruelty, and the importance of remembering the names of the fallen. In the telling and retelling, Moses was transformed. He was no longer just a victim, he became a martyr, a symbol of quiet defiance. His refusal to break, his endurance in the face of unimaginable suffering, became a source of a strange, sorrowful strength for those who came after him. He represented the unbroken spirit, the part of a person that even a monster like Thistlewood could not touch. The story served as a permanent indictment of the system, a moral record kept by those who the system tried to erase. Long after the official histories were written, long after Thistlewood's journal was locked away, the oral tradition kept the truth alive. It ensured that the crime would not be forgotten. It is through these forbidden channels, these whispers in the dark, that the most important histories are often preserved. They are a testament to the resilience of memory and the enduring power of a story to bear witness to both the worst of humanity and the quiet, unbreakable dignity of its victims. The physical traces of Whispering Pines are gone. The fields have been paved over, the great house has collapsed, and the precise location of the tobacco shed is known only to the silent trees. But the story remains. It has outlived the Cotton Kingdom, outlived the men who perpetrated the crime, and outlived the system that allowed it. It exists now as a chilling echo, a cold case from a dark past that continues to haunt the present. It forces us to ask unsettling questions. How many other stories like this one are buried in the soil of the past, their details lost, their victims nameless? How many other forbidden journals sit on dusty shelves, their horrifying truths waiting to be discovered? The tale of the 1807 wager is a stark reminder that history is not a settled, comfortable thing. It is a landscape filled with unmarked graves and restless ghosts. The overseer who made a bet to starve a slave to death was not a mythical demon. He was a man. And the world that created him was not a distant, alien land. It is the foundation of our own. And so, the story ends, as all such macabre histories must, not with a neat resolution, but with a lingering, disturbing chill. It leaves us alone in the quiet darkness, with the weight of what we have heard, and the horrifying knowledge that some curses are not supernatural. They are simply the echoes of a truth that refuses to be silenced.